Boris Johnson was clearly bamboozled by the science, apparently, according to the COVID pandemic during it, and it was often a challenge to help him understand the graphs of the data. That's the bombshell claim from the government's chief scientific advisor during the pandemic, who has been giving all, evidence to the public inquiry today. Sir Patrick Vallance recalled the former Prime Minister having his head in his hands a lot and forgetting information he'd only been told a few hours ago.
I think I'm right in saying that the Prime Minister at the time gave up science when he was 15. And I think he'd be the first to admit it wasn't his forte, and that he did struggle with some of the concepts, and we did need to repeat them often. It was hard work sometimes to try and make sure that he had understood what a particular graph or piece of data was saying. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings were extremely keen to get scientific advice. So they had I would say, a disproportionate interest in getting science advice. But as you can see, it wasn't always easy to provide it in a way that was understood and actionable by the Prime Minister.
Still with me is TalkTV's international editor, Isabel Oakeshott. I'm also joined by consultant virologist and lecturer at Cambridge University, Dr. Chris Smith. Chris, welcome to the conversation. Isabel, I find that a bit snobbish, to be honest. If a scientist is having trouble explaining science to a Prime Minister, surely it's because he's not explaining it right, isn't it?
Well, on this very rare occasion, my sympathies actually do lie with Boris Johnson. You know, as a journalist over the years, I've dealt with many scientists, and the one thing that they are generally very poor at is actually communication. So, you know, we all know that for whatever Boris Johnson's many faults may be, he is a highly, highly intelligent man. And I really struggle to believe that he found it too difficult to grasp the concepts that he needed to grasp. He probably didn't need to know anything in minute detail. He needed to have a basic grasp of what was going on. And I suspect really that the fault lay with those who were communicating it poorly. This was only one of a number of quite jaw-dropping moments in the evidence from Patrick Vallance. Very different tone to that of Dominic Cummings. No expletives, no no damning criticism of colleagues. Vallance was very careful in the words that he chose, but he had made a number of quite sensational late night entries into his private notebooks and diaries in which he criticised the very weak lack of leadership, and also most sensationally reported Dominic Cummings suggesting that Rishi Sunak, the then Chancellor, thought it would be okay if people just died. That was, for me, the moment I sort of went, wow. You know, if that quote had got out at the time, it would have caused an absolute furore. But it is, of course, reported. It's he said, she said. We don't know whether Rishi Sunak ever expressed anything like those sentiments. It came via Dominic Cummings, and I think everything from him has to go through a bit of a truth filter.
Yes, I think so. And Dr. Chris, let me come to you, because, I mean, I think under the circumstances that we know of and that we've heard about, and some of the other things that Patrick Vallance said today, I mean, he said himself the science is not something that you can just follow, because it isn't simply the science. It's you know, it moves around. It's not always exactly what you want it to be. And so presumably there was an awful lot of confusion inside Downing Street and inside even the scientific community, because an awful lot of what they were looking at was behavioural science as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, he also made one interesting point, which is that he said one of Boris Johnson's tactics was often to say the opposite of what he'd been told in order to challenge the person who'd said it, just to see if they were saying the same thing twice, to make sure that they weren't wavering. So that's, I think, certainly true, that you can actually turn it round and see if someone repeats themselves. And I think that's probably quite valid. The other interesting thing that Patrick Vallance said was he opened at the opening moments this morning. They dwelled quite heavily on the fact that there's very low representation of people from a scientific background recruited into the graduate programme in the civil service. And he used the statistic of about 90% of people come from an arts background, about 10% from a scientific background, and made the case that perhaps there would be a more receptive audience among civil servants if more were recruited from a STEM background, and said there is now a target to try to increase that to about 50%. That's due to report next year. So it was a mixed bag today, and I think there's a range of very interesting things that surfaced. And for me, that statistic was very interesting, but also the question of he was directly challenged on whether or not we could have avoided that first lockdown. And we saw some interesting data, some interesting sentiments being expressed there that were less clear when that happened for real. And I think we saw a new insight into those today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a scientist yourself, I mean, is there a reason why people who study science don't particularly want to get into politics?
Yeah, well, it was funny, wasn't it? Because one of the other points that Patrick Vallance made was that this is the first time we've really heard politicians hiding behind the science by using phrases like "we are following the science," as though it's holding some massive cosh over them.
Yeah.
You don't see, this was the example given by another witness at the inquiry, which is you don't see us saying we're following the economics because of making certain financial decisions, for example. But I think that science is a difficult thing to communicate. And when you've got a situation that's very fast paced, it's moving at a terrific rate with all kinds of different opinions and perspectives, and especially where stats get involved. You know, there's that old saying, lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's very hard to keep track on statistics in your mind when they're changing, when there's large numbers of numbers being thrown at you. And I think when you're in a decision-making role, it is really important to make sure the information presented to you is clear and precise. And it can be very, very difficult under ferocious situations like this would have been to actually just have very clear, precise information to go on. There would have been enormous numbers of facts flying around, different opinions, tempers would have been raging, and I think it's very, very easy to condemn this after the fact. But when you're in that sort of situation, and I was sort of in a situation in the hospital over COVID, where we were having meetings to try to decide how we were going to manage our cases and keep our infection rates down, and it was very, very challenging at the time. So I do have sympathy for people who, across COVID, had to make those sorts of decisions on an hourly basis, 24/7 in some cases.
I think so, yeah. And back to you, Isabel. I mean, it was very clear, wasn't it, from what we know so far, from the work you've done, from the WhatsApp messages that you've seen, from the stuff we saw with the Telegraph project that you were involved with. You know, there was so much information and so much counter-information that it was almost impossible to navigate, you know, the true path, if you like. You know, people would be saying, well, this is what they're doing in the EU, this is what they're doing in America, this is what they're doing in Florida, that's not what they're doing in Sweden. I mean, it was a very difficult time. I'm not trying to give, you know, sort of succour and comfort to the politicians, but I can imagine it was a very tough place to be.
Oh, undoubtedly. And much of what we heard today was about the Prime Minister's apparent indecision in autumn 2020, where instinctively he really, really did not want to have another lockdown. And he was doing what prime ministers should and listening to a range of voices. And he brought in a couple of what we'd now call lockdown skeptics into Downing Street, who gave a very different perspective on the options that were available to him. And he did vacillate and he did wrestle with that decision. And frankly, I don't think he should be blamed for wrestling with it. From my perspective, he should have trusted his instincts. And unfortunately, in the end, he caved in to the tremendous pressure to continue with lockdowns for an awful lot longer after that. But I think it's unfair to condemn him for sometimes wanting to hear a range of views and having some doubts in his own mind as to the best path, because there were so many different things to weigh up. And as Patrick Vallance said today, you know, much of this was political decision making. Yeah. It had to be. I mean, Patrick Vallance complained that he had asked for clarity from the government on a so-called acceptable rate of mortality. Well, I understand why, as a scientist, he wanted that. But can you imagine politically it getting out that the government had set a figure on how many people it was okay to die? I mean, that would have been extraordinarily difficult politically to justify. And this goes to the heart of it, doesn't it? It's that tension between the ultra cautious approach, perhaps suggested by science, if you want to eliminate deaths where possible, never going to be possible to eliminate, but to utterly minimize it, and the politics of it, where you've got to consider health in the round. What are the consequences, not just the economic consequences, but the broader health consequences, which we're now feeling, of shutting everything down, locking everyone up and turning the NHS into a COVID service.
And in many ways, that's the stuff that I'm interested in. I'm waiting to see whether those questions get asked as well. But Isabel Oakeshott, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Chris Smith as well, thank you.